The first snowfall came early that year, but no one paid it much mind. After all, the frost had a way of testing every man and woman who dared call this stretch of frontier home, and folks had gotten used to bluffing through blizzards with bravado. But while most homesteads braced with tar paper patches and drafty seams, one cabin stayed warm, and it was the one they all laughed at, the one with the tree growing straight through its roof. They said she'd lost her mind, said the widow was touched in the head from grief, said no woman with sense would ever build a cabin that way, much less by herself, much less with 2 small children underfoot. They said a lot of things, until the wind came screaming through the gulch and made fools of nearly everyone. But before the freeze, before the looks of envy and the long nights of regret, there was only silence and sawdust and the steady sound of an axe. Her name was Clara Holt, and she wasn't a woman who made noise. That was part of the reason folks didn't think much of her when she arrived. Sunburned and dusty in a borrowed wagon with 2 kids too quiet for their age and a mule that looked like it hadn't eaten proper in a week. No husband, no father, no men riding with her, just a death certificate folded into the pocket of her dress, and a piece of land deeded over from a military pension that hadn't paid enough to keep her in the town back east. The clerk at the land office barely looked up when she signed her name. She picked the edge of the ridge, not the flatlands where most cabins had gone up that spring, but the rise just above them, rocky, shaded, tangled with roots and thickets. Not good soil, they said, not wise, but it had something the rest didn't. A gnarled old oak that had survived wind, lightning, and 3 separate attempts to cut it down before the town was even founded. That tree had been there longer than the surveyor's stakes, longer than the dust trail in, longer than memory. Clara walked right up to it and placed her palm on the bark. Then she started digging. People came to watch, because of course they did. Nothing brought out curiosity like a woman trying to do a man's work, especially one with shoulders too narrow, arms too pale, and no fire in her eyes, just something quiet and unshakable. She didn't argue, didn't ask, didn't explain. She just cleared brush, carried stones, and chopped timber like her arms didn't care about pain. The first time they saw her frame going up, it didn't make sense. She was building a square, but right there in the center of the floor, the tree. She hadn't cut it down. She hadn't even trimmed the low limbs, just left it standing, roots and all, and stacked her wall beams around it like it belonged. When her children asked if the tree would mind, she only said, "It'll keep us company." The men chuckled, called it the widow's folly, said she must have misunderstood how chimneys worked, said the smoke would never vent right, said the roots would crack her foundation in spring, said termites would eat through her walls like sawdust pie, said snow would pile against the trunk and cave her roof in, said no man in his right mind would ever help her finish it, and no man did. But she didn't stop. By October, the roof was on, pitched sharp and slanted low, like she'd meant to trap the heat and let nothing out. Clay chinking sealed each seam tight. She'd built a second inner frame against the walls, insulating with sheep's wool, hay, and layers of stitched scrap she'd carried from her old life. She'd even double-paned her windows with hand-cut glass, packed in beeswax to stop drafts. And the tree, she wrapped the trunk in burlap soaked in turpentine and hung a small lantern near the base, like a hearth. The children helped. One was 6, the other 4, but they carried stones, stacked wood, and kept the fire pit dry with oiled canvas during the rains. Never once did they cry about the cold. Never once did she raise her voice. It was as if that house was built not just with wood and labor, but with grief and purpose and something quieter still. The first snow came during the town's harvest festival. Most settlers were still patching their eaves and laying extra logs by the fire. Clara's cabin smoked like a pipe, steady, warm, and low. When Old Man Ridder passed by on his horse, he saw her boys playing barefoot on the porch and swore it must be some trick. The cabin didn't look like it should work, but it did. By November, rumors started that she'd found some hidden spring under the hill, that the tree was hollow and filled with coal, that she was a witch, that she slept with the devil, that maybe the army hadn't taken her husband, maybe she'd killed him. When folks don't understand a thing, they make stories to cover the silence. But one man did understand, and that's where the real trouble began. Elias Dawn was a carpenter, not a good one, not honest, but clever with his hands and good at taking credit. He'd come west chasing contracts and wives and had found neither, but he had pride. And when folks started saying maybe that widow had built something smarter than all the men put together, he came riding up to see it himself. She was chopping kindling when he arrived, sleeves rolled, hair tied, eyes wary. He didn't dismount, just looked at the roofline, the chimney, the vent gaps around the trunk. "You got a stove in there?" he asked. "No," she said. "Fire pit. You draw with a flue? Goes up the side. Heat wraps the trunk." He nodded like he understood, but he didn't, not really. "You'll get mold. Sap'll rot your ceiling. Mice'll nest in the root gaps." She didn't answer. "You'll need a man to fix it. Come spring, She raised the hatchet slightly, not as a threat, more like a warning to be finished. He didn't ride away angry, just curious, and that's worse. By December, 3 cabins had frozen pipes, 2 had roof collapses, 1 caught fire. The snow had come thick and hard, trapping smoke inside the wrong chimneys and splitting green logs in half. But the widow's cabin held fast, not only warm, dry, and still no one could explain how. It wasn't until Christmas Eve that the town got desperate enough to knock. The Cobb family, 5 children, one of them coughing blood, the youngest too small to speak, had been trapped for 2 nights when their roof finally gave way. No fire, no shelter. They'd tried the schoolhouse but found the doors iced shut. The preacher's home was full. The inn had turned them away. So they came to the widow's door. Clara opened it without a word and stepped aside. The tree stood behind her, rising straight through the roof, its bark lit by a single hanging lantern and a shelf of dried herbs. Heat rolled out like breath. The children stared. The mother wept. That night, 6 more came. By morning, there were 11 souls huddled in that small cabin. None of them could explain it. The walls didn't sweat. The air stayed even. The logs burned slow. And somehow, every child found sleep. But not Elias Dawn. He watched from the rise, snow clinging to his coat, eyes narrowed. He wasn't coming to ask anymore. He was coming to claim. The storm didn't break that morning. If anything, it thickened. Wind barreled in from the north, sharp as knives, scouring the ridge until the pine bark peeled. Windows in the valley cracked. Snow gathered like battering rams against doors. But inside Clara Holt's strange, tree-bound cabin, the air was still. She'd fed the fire, slow-burning cottonwood through the night, the kind that smoldered without choking. The tree's trunk, warmed from below, gave off an odd, earthy scent. Not smoke, not sap, but something dry and living. Heat rose in the walls like a wrapped coil, caught between the bark and beams. The children, her own and the others, slept in makeshift beds along the inner perimeter, nearest the warmth. The youngest ones had no coughs, no frostbite, no shivers. She hadn't said a word all night, just watched. Outside, Elias Dawn was still watching too. It was near dawn when he finally made his move. He didn't knock, just came trudging up the ridge, face wind-burnt, mouth twisted in something not quite anger, not quite hunger. He carried no tools, no gift, no offering, just a crumpled deed in his coat pocket and the conviction that something inside that house didn't belong to her. Clara answered his pounding with silence. He shouted over the wind. "You built that on my claim," he yelled. "Boundary stones 20 feet east. I got it marked from spring." She didn't reply. He shouted again. "You build around a tree, the roots spread wide. My land's underneath it." Still nothing. He put his hand on the latch, and the door opened before he could push. Clara stood in the entry. No coat, no gun, just eyes that didn't flinch. "This house don't owe you," she said. "Then why's half the damn town in it?" "They came cold," she said. "I let 'em in. You want warmth? Bring your heart first." Elias laughed, bitter and hoarse. "That tree's mine." "No, it isn't." He shoved past her. The heat hit him like a slap. Not dry stove heat, but something deeper, like the kind that settles in old cellars and steams up root vegetables. It smelled of thyme, wood smoke, and sap. He paused near the tree, eyes scanning the low-hung shelves and pots, the moss-packed cracks in the wall, the folded quilts against the inner beams. Everything stitched, tucked, and layered like she'd been born in the dirt and remembered how it held heat. He walked once around the trunk, tapping the boards with his boot, like a man trying to find fault in a floor. The children stirred. One of the Cobb girls whimpered and reached toward the fire. Clara said nothing. She watched him circle. When he finally turned back, he didn't speak of roots or land or deeds. Instead, he said, "You're hiding something." She tilted her head. "You think I buried coals under it? I think maybe your husband ain't dead at all. Maybe he's under this house, stoking your fire." That was when she stepped forward, not with violence, not even with heat, just stillness, and a gaze that cut sharper than his frostbitten hands. "My husband's in Tennessee soil," she said. "What I built here's mine." "But it shouldn't work," he said. "That's what don't sit right," Clara shrugged. "It ain't built to work. It's built to last." He didn't stay, but he didn't leave clean either. The next morning, when the wind settled just enough for sound to travel, the town heard Elias Dawn at the saloon, drunk, bitter, spitting stories like acid. Said the widow was keeping heat in that trunk by feeding it blood. Said she cooked meat that didn't come from deer. Said there was something under her floorboards, a hollow space that hummed. "Mark my words," he he told the blacksmith. "That cabin's cursed." The blacksmith didn't answer. He was too busy rubbing the frostbite on his hands. His own stove had cracked a week ago. He hadn't slept warm since. By that night, 3 more men knocked on Clara's door. They didn't bring rumors, just blankets and children and silence. She let them in one by one. It was too much, of course. Too many mouths, too many limbs trying to sleep near the hearth. Even with the extra quilts, even with the barrel stove Clara had improvised from salvaged iron rings and stone-packed clay, the air was thinning, so she opened the hatch. No one had noticed the trapdoor, not even Elias. It was cut clean beneath the cot her children had shared, and below it, dug right between the roots of the tree, was a narrow cellar, not for food, not for storage, for air. She'd dug a channel into the hill behind her cabin, lined it with clay, packed it with hay and birch bark. It ran deep, winding in a soft slope, terminating behind a false brush wall 24 yards west. She'd built it that summer, while the children slept, one spade at a time, a breathing tunnel, a warm draft that carried air into the belly of the cabin from where the sun still reached the rocks. That was her secret. Not magic, not spirits, not trickery, just earth. When she lit the vent candles, the tunnel began to pull, soft, slow air, rising through the root paths, through the floor gaps she'd left open, warming gently from the lantern heat and passing through the room like a sigh. The children stopped coughing, the glass panes unfogged, and from the tree, steam rose. The settlers didn't understand, not really, but they believed what their bodies told them, that this place, strange as it was, worked, even as snow piled high enough to bury fence posts, even as smoke from other chimneys turned black with soot and failure. Clara's cabin held, and then someone died. It was Henry Blas, the teamster. Hart gave out hauling supplies up the creek trail. His wife was in town with fever. His 2 boys had taken shelter in the schoolhouse with 7 others. When word came that Henry had collapsed near the ridge path, 2 men went to find him. They returned white-faced. His body had frozen solid, mouth open, hand clutched to his chest. Boots sunk in snow like a statue, and no animal tracks near him, no drag marks, just his own footprints leading to where he died. Clara, upon hearing this, stepped into her boots, wrapped her shawl and picked up her shovel. "I'll dig," she said. "You can't," one man said. "The ground's iron. I'll find where it's soft." And she did. She buried him near the roots of the tree, not beneath it, but near. The townsfolk watched as she chose the west side, where snow melted slightly faster, where the sun caught the corner of her roof for 3 hours a day. She dug with steady rhythm until earth broke loose and the grave was made. Then she wrapped Henry's body in a wool coat, said no words, and filled the hole herself. From that day forward, no one mocked her again. They still didn't understand her, but they respected the warmth. It would have ended there, might have been a quiet legend, a whispered story traded by firesides for years to come. But Elias Dawn wasn't finished. He returned one night, not drunk, not shouting, just quiet and sharp, and bearing kerosene. He waited until the wind had died, until Clara and the children were asleep, until the smoke from her chimney slowed, and then he circled behind the cabin, splashing oil on the base of the tree. He struck the match, but the flame didn't catch, not right away. The bark was too damp, the cloth she'd wrapped it in too soaked with clay wash and turpentine. The oil smoked, hissed, and caught, but not with fury, just a slow smolder, curling black, chewing the edge of the burlap. By the time the dog barked, a mutt someone had left on her doorstep weeks ago, Clara was already up. And so were 4 of the older boys. They burst out into the snow. Elias stood with the match still in his hand. He didn't run, just stared at her with an empty kind of hate, like something frozen inside had cracked and couldn't be thawed. "You built a shrine," he said, "to death, to grief." She stepped past the fire, threw a pail of water at the smolder, and whispered, "No, I built it to remember how to live." He lunged, and that was when the tree split. Not the trunk, not fully, just the outer bark, groaning with sudden heat and pressure. A knot near the base cracked loud as gunshot. A jet of hot sap hissed out, spraying Elias's chest. He screamed, dropped the match, fell. When the others reached him, his coat was smoking, not fire, steam. The sap had boiled from the fire beneath, rushed through the roots, and vented through the weakest seam in the bark. Elias didn't burn, but he never spoke right again. The sheriff came, asked questions. Clara gave her account, soft and slow, every word plain. He nodded, took notes, then packed up and left. No charges were filed. And that winter, the cabin sheltered 17. One of the children grew up to be a carpenter, said he never built a house without a root cellar and a central beam left exposed. He called it the Holt method, and never once, in the decades to come, did that cabin go cold. The story of the tree spread further than Clara Holt ever intended. By the time the thaw came, whispers about the woman who built warmth into her walls had trickled beyond the ridge, down into the trading posts of Bear Hook Gulch, through the tongues of trappers along the Salter Trail, and even as far as the river towns that barely believed winter could touch them. Most thought it was tall talk, a myth, the kind of tale loggers told each other to pass long nights over half-frozen beans. But the people who'd lived through that winter didn't call it legend. They called it luck, they called it grace, and some of them quietly called it a miracle. Clara, of course, called it none of those things. She just called it home. When spring arrived, it didn't announce itself with green buds or bird songs. It came as silence. The wind finally dropped its howl, the snow ceased its threats, and in that eerie hush, ice began to crack along rooflines and drip from eaves like tears. The valley below Clara's ridge sat battered and beaten, cabins caved, livestock frozen, entire rows of fencing half swallowed by frost. Even the well behind the church had collapsed inward, frozen so deep the preacher claimed it was God's judgment made solid. But not Clara's home. It stood clean, unbroken, like it had known how to hold its breath through the storm. Smoke still curled from the side flue chimney. The tree still rose tall through the roof, now crowned in newborn buds, pale green against the grey sky. Her children still swept the porch each morning, as if that simple act could ward off all suffering. And in the soil nearest the trunk, where no one thought life could take root, crocuses began to bloom. The townsfolk didn't know what to make of it, but they knew they wanted closer. The first to visit that spring was Ruth McKellar, the widow of a miner lost in the silver collapse the year before. She arrived with 2 sons and a hollowed-out look that Clara recognized too well. "I won't beg," Ruth said, standing at the door with her bonnet in hand. "But I'll listen." Clara said nothing, just opened the door wider. That became the pattern. Others followed, not with demands, not with tools to pry apart the walls and see how she did it, but with questions gentler than their boots. Could she teach them to pack walls with hay and wool? Could she show how to carve vent tunnels? Could they see how she sealed the roots? Clara never turned them away, but she didn't explain, not the way they expected. She didn't lay out blueprints or offer diagrams. She told them to sit by the tree, to feel the heat through the floor, to close their eyes and listen to how the draft moved. One man, a former railroad builder from Missouri, said it made his bones ache with memory. "I ain't heard silence this kind since my wife died," he muttered, running his palm along the trunk. "Felt like the world been yelling since." The tree creaked softly, like it agreed. Some tried to copy her cabin outright. They measured out beams with the same angles, tried to rope pines to leave standing in the center, but something always went wrong. The bark peeled, the roof warped. One man in Dry Gull tried to thread 2 trunks through his living room floor and ended up with frost tunnels that invited wolves. They didn't understand. The tree wasn't just a shape to be copied. It was part of the breath of that home, a pillar not just of wood, but of memory. Every board around it had been measured to accommodate life, not resist it. The frame was tighter where the roots curled. The floor beams left just enough give to shift in spring without breaking seal. The ceiling sloped deliberately to allow steam to roll upward and out rather than pool into mold. And deeper than all that, there was Clara's eye for the land itself. She hadn't picked the spot because it was easy. She picked it because it was right. That knowledge couldn't be duplicated. It had to be earned. The sheriff came again in April, this time with no badge showing and no notebook. Just 2 mules, a pack of salt pork, and a quiet look in his eyes. He stood at the base of the ridge and waited until Clara came into view. "I ain't here for trouble," he called up. She nodded once, slowly. He climbed halfway, then stopped. "I buried my brother this week. Cabin collapsed." "Thought you should know." She stepped down from the porch. "I'm sorry. He'd built it strong, used the plans from that preacher book, even had iron nails." Clara just waited. "Heard yours didn't shake once." "It shook," she said. "It just held on." The sheriff didn't move for a long time. Then he said something strange. "I think you're raising more than kids up here." She tilted her head. "You're raising hope." Not all the attention was welcome. Some men, hearing of her warmth, came not for shelter but for ownership. A trader named Barrett offered her a new roof and 10 goats if she'd sell. Another tried to convince her to open it as an inn. "Charge by the hour, make yourself rich before next freeze." A third, drunk off corn liquor, tried to buy her children outright. Clara didn't answer him. Her axe did. After that, the warnings spread again. Not that she was crazy, that she was dangerous. Good. It kept the wrong ones out. Elias Dawn, for all his poison, didn't die that winter. He stayed in the valley, wrapped in silence, face burned with red streaks that never fully faded. He wouldn't look Clara in the eye when they passed in town, wouldn't speak, wouldn't nod. Some said the sap had melted part of his sense. Others said it woke something he didn't want seen. He never built another cabin. He stayed in the loft above the stable, muttering to himself, never once asking again about land deeds or boundary stones. He didn't even attend the town's spring gathering, the first since the freeze. Clara did. She came in a plain blue dress, no frills, hair pulled back in a simple tie. Her boys wore matching homespun shirts, each mended along the cuffs but clean and straight. She didn't speak unless spoken to, but when she passed through the crowd, it parted, not in fear, in respect. The preacher raised his glass and said, "Some folks teach us sermons with words, others do it with walls." No one laughed, no one clapped, but they all looked at her. Clara just inclined her head, eyes low. She didn't want thanks. She wanted quiet. That summer, they built a schoolhouse near the ridge, not on it, not too close, but close enough to see the crown of her tree over the rise. The schoolmarm, Miss Etta Gray, asked Clara if her children could be the first enrolled. "They already read," Clara said. "I know," Etta replied, "but they can teach the others." Clara didn't answer for a long time. Finally, she nodded. "Only if they still split wood in the morning. They can teach that too," the schoolmarm said. And so, bit by bit, the story of the widow's cabin stopped being a story. It became a standard. By fall, others had dug tunnels of their own, not as clean, not as clever, but inspired by her air flue. One man even tried wrapping his central post in burlap, soaked it in pine tar, and claimed it smelled just like Clara's tree when heated. They started calling it tree warming. Even folks who didn't believe in her design started copying it. They wouldn't admit it out loud, but they began leaving central beams uncut, using root-depth logs, even bending their walls to work with the ground instead of against it. One boy wrote in the schoolhouse chalk, "The tree stands and the house breathes." That phrase lingered. The preacher worked it into a sermon. A traveling poet from the river towns scrawled it into a leather notebook. One old woman carved it into her walking stick, but Clara never spoke of it. She just prepared again. Winter never forgot the ridge. That next cold season came slower, heavier, like it had learned from the last. The winds didn't screech, they stalked. The frost came in through the ground, not just the sky, curling under floorboards and into cellar cracks, like a creeping hand. And when it did, the cabins below were better, stronger, but many still failed, because strength wasn't enough. Warmth wasn't about resisting the cold, it was about understanding it, and no one understood it like Clara. Her home stayed warm again. The tree bloomed early, the tunnels breathed steady, and this time no one mocked. They knocked with food in hand. They left candles at her gate. They passed tools down the slope without being asked. And when a boy from the mill slipped in the frost and shattered his arm, Clara set the bone cleaner than the doctor ever had. They started calling her Mother Tree. She didn't like it, but she didn't stop them either. Years passed. Years passed. The valley changed. Roads came. Wagons gave way to steam trucks. Timber rights were sold. A mining operation opened briefly at the southern edge before failing. Children grew, moved, married. Storms still came, but the cabins below were stronger now, built with Clara's principles, even when her name wasn't spoken aloud. One storm, 15 years after her death, tested them all. They called it the Black Freeze. The snow came down hard for 7 days straight, with temperatures that cracked iron. Livestock died mid-step. Entire homes iced shut. But the Holt cabin didn't shudder. Its vents breathed. Its central trunk, now wrapped by new wooden paneling for reinforcement, steamed gently all night. Inside were 6 people. None Holts, a couple whose baby had arrived 2 weeks early, a trapper who'd broken his leg, and a boy who'd run from a home where his father's fists came too fast and too often. They didn't know each other before the storm. By spring, they called each other kin. After that, the Holts opened the cabin for good, not as a museum, not as a shrine, but as a refuge. They repaired the sleeping lofts, restocked the stores, planted winter vegetables in raised boxes along the slope. They didn't advertise, but word still spread. A traveling journalist from Houston showed up in the early 1900s, wearing a city coat too thin for the wind and a mustache that seemed frozen in place. He spent one night in the cabin and wrote a 4-page piece titled "The Widow and Her Tree, a House That Breathes Warmth." The piece spread, got reprinted, got polished by editors until Clara's story became nearly unrecognizable. They called her Clarabelle, said her tree was a magical oak that granted warmth to any who touched it, claimed her sons were forest spirits. One version even insisted the roots led to an underground spring of molten gold. The Holts clipped every one of those articles and burned them in the stove. The truth was enough. The boy who'd once etched "The tree stands and the house breathes" into schoolhouse chalk returned one year with a family of his own. 3 daughters, one of them sick. He asked to stay for the winter. No pride, no pretending, just tired eyes and a quiet voice. The Holts didn't hesitate. They'd built extra cots. That winter, the girls learned how to listen, not just to stories, but to the walls, how the tree creaked before a wind, how the floorboards shifted with the breath of the earth, how the warmest spots weren't always near the fire, but sometimes near a particular root path. They wrote letters home to their cousins, describing the tree like it was alive, which, in a way, it was. One morning, the youngest daughter pressed her ear to the bark and said, "It's talking." The Holts smiled. "What's it saying?" She paused, serious. "It said Mama cried in here. It said it remembers." She wasn't wrong. Clara had cried there, had laughed too, had held her boys when they were sick, had buried her husband's photograph under the floor when it finally cracked from handling, had stitched the quilt that now wrapped 100 strangers. The tree did remember, and it didn't keep secrets. Another spring, another thaw. That year, a fire hit the valley, not from within, but from above. Lightning struck near the Preacher's Hill and rolled fast. 4 cabins lost. One family fled so quickly they left their daughter behind. The Holts heard the screams. They didn't wait for help. The younger Holt son, now old enough for grey in his beard, ran straight into the smoke, found the girl wrapped in a wet cloth crying near the garden patch, alone. He lifted her, ran until his lungs gave, and didn't stop until the smoke was behind him. He didn't bring her to the doctor. He brought her to the tree. It was still warm. It always was. Eventually, the town changed names. Maps updated. Boundaries shifted. Some newcomers never heard of Clara, but those who lived on the ridge never forgot. Once a year, first snow, they left something at the foot of the tree. A mitten, a drawing, a letter, a small wrapped jar of jam. One year, someone left an axe, polished, unused, with a note tied to the handle. She never needed to swing it twice. And then, on the 50th year after her death, something unexpected happened. The tree blossomed red, not blood red, not dark, but the kind of red you see in sunsets before the cold arrives. Crimson fire, CH, carved at the base, caught the light just so. People swore they felt heat even before entering the house. That winter, no one asked for shelter. They were already building their own, using her methods, her rhythm, her grace, and when the storm came, as it always did, every home held. Not a single soul froze. The valley had learned. Because one woman, once mocked, had dared to build with life, not against it. She didn't fight the land. She listened to it, and in doing so, she taught the world to listen too. Years became decades. Children grew into parents. The valley swelled, then quieted. The old trails vanished beneath railway lines, and the same roads that once carried wagons now bore gasoline and rubber tires. Yet at the top of the ridge, the cabin remained. Not unchanged. No structure endures so long without shifting. Time wears corners, wind bows beams. But Clara's house didn't age the way others did. It settled, it adapted, its breath never stopped. Its purpose never blurred. And the tree, her tree, stood as it always had, taller now, its upper branches long since piercing through the patched roof, bark darker, thicker, traced with the faint silver scars of lightning strikes it had endured and outlived. Birds nested in its crown, moss clung to its north side, and every winter, without fail, the steam still rose from its base like incense. It was never worshipped, but it was remembered, and that's what mattered. The Holts, now 3 generations deep, never left. The younger ones came and went, scattered across counties and cities, but always returned to the cabin with the tree. Holidays, harvests, the first snow. Always someone came back to check the vents, stoke the fire, leave an offering at the crocus bed. They didn't lock the door. They didn't post signs. It wasn't a museum, wasn't a relic. It was still a home. One winter during the war years, a stranger arrived. Not from the valley, not from the state even. A young soldier returned from Europe, still hollow-eyed from what he'd seen in frozen forests. His boots were worn, his coat thin. He asked for no one by name, just climbed the ridge without knowing why. He sat on the steps of the cabin without knocking, without expecting anything. The wind began to blow. The door opened. A girl, no older than 10, hair in braids, stood with a lamp in her hand and said, "It's warmer if you come inside." He did. He stayed through the storm. When he left, he carved nothing, took no photos. But he told others, in taverns, in letters, around campfires, that once, in the worst winter of his life, a tree held him like a mother. More came. A widow who'd lost her son, a pastor who'd lost his faith, a railroad man who'd lost 3 fingers, and couldn't bear to hold a hammer again. They all found the same thing, not magic, not miracle, but permission. Permission to sit with their hurt, to be warm without explaining, to hear the way floorboards talk when no one fills them with noise. One woman described it best in her journal. It's the kind of quiet that listens back. The legend shifted again. As new voices passed the tale, details bent, not because of lies, but because of awe. Some said Clara's cabin healed those who entered. Some said the roots of the tree wrapped around the hearth like arms. Some claimed the air inside the home could never drop below body temperature, not even when the fire died. The Holts never corrected anyone. They didn't need to. Because the truth was better, not because it was more dramatic, but because it was earned. One woman, alone, carved warmth from cold, not with spells or scripture, but with knowledge and sorrow and care. That was miracle enough. On the 100th year since Clara's death, the town gathered on the ridge. It wasn't a ceremony. It wasn't a festival. It was a visit. Families lined the path in silence, carrying hand-stitched quilts and written notes, laying them gently at the base of the tree. The house had been freshly cleaned, windows scrubbed, the stove relined with new clay, the crocus bed in full bloom. There was no speaker, no preacher, just a fire crackling inside, and an empty chair by the hearth. It had been Clara's. It still was. A little girl, same age Clara's youngest would have been when she arrived on the ridge, climbed the front steps, barefoot despite the frost. She stood by the tree trunk, ran her fingers along the old carved letters. CH. She whispered something no one could hear, but the wind died down when she did, and for a moment the smoke from the chimney curled into the shape of a circle, like a wreath, like a ring. Then it broke apart, drifted skyward, and was gone. Time eventually came for the house, not in violence, not in storm, in quiet. One spring, the Holt heir, the last bearing the name, a woman named Ruth, after Clara's first shelter seeker, locked the door not out of rejection, but reverence. She was moving down the ridge, not far, but far enough. Her joints ached too much for the slope. She built a new home. But when she drew the blueprints, they looked familiar. Central tree beam, simulated of course, foundation raised, flue hidden behind a false chimney, vents under the root cellar, handmade quilts lining the wall. I didn't design it, she told the builder. I just remembered. Clara's cabin was left empty, but not alone. That summer, the crocus bed exploded into color, not just purple and white, but wild yellow blossoms no one remembered planting. Bees came, so did rabbits. The tree flourished, and then, in fall, something happened no one expected. The roof began to sag, gently. The walls leaned inward, not from rot or wind, but like shoulders curling in to embrace something. The entire house settled. By winter's end, the chimney collapsed. The next spring, a sapling rose in its place. The ridge is quiet now. Trails still lead there, though fewer walk them. But every now and then, on the first snowfall, someone will hike up and find the stump of the old tree, now hollow, filled with dried flowers and candle stubs, and feel a warmth that doesn't match the season. And if they wait long enough, and breathe deep enough, they'll hear it too. The whisper of floorboards, the echo of children laughing, the memory of an axe falling not in rage but in purpose, and the voice of a woman, low and steady, saying, "If you listen to the land, it'll tell you how to live." That was all she ever did, and it was enough.